Okay, so in all actuality, this morning we're going to begin a series called Re-Organic. It's kind of a cumbersome title, and so let me explain it. My inspiration there is like reply, as in an email, right? Like the RE colon that goes before the subject of an email, like a response to an idea or a thought or a question or a suggestion, a frustration, a story, maybe even an annoying forward. Do you just delete all forwards? Yeah. All forward haters unite. Organic is short for organic kingdom bringing. Organic kingdom bringing is a concept that we've worked very, very hard to infuse into the culture of Narrate, literally from the word go. In fact, some of you may or may not recall a video that we did in our very first sermon series called Christian Detox, in which we put together a whole 40-minute video, or I don't remember how long it was, that just simply unpacked what is for us a central value called organic kingdom bringing.
We want to create an experience in which we unpack this idea that we call organic kingdom bringing. And really what we mean by that is the permission that Jesus gives us to serve him, not by doing a bunch of religious stuff, what some people might call a religious treadmill, but by being a different kind of person in our everyday, organic, mundane life. So this idea of organic kingdom bringing for us is this idea that like serving Jesus and bringing heaven to earth, it's not about running off and doing foreign stuff or even running off into other places and building new relationships with people we don't already have a relationship with, so much as it's about having a different presence about us where we already live our lives, among the people we already live our lives among.
Organic kingdom bringing is a concept that is really, in my view, not inspired from here. It's not an idea that came up here. It's an idea that we take from students of first century Jewish life. Scholars of both those who follow Jesus and those who don't will note that Jesus lived a remarkably typical existence. Like he lived a very typical first century Jewish existence. Now, don't misunderstand that. I'm not for a second suggesting that Jesus in his personhood was typical. I, like many of you, believe that he was God, that he was the Son of God, that he was Savior, that in his death and resurrection was a freedom from sin that's not possible outside of belief in relationship with him. I, like many of you, embrace grace and the fact that we don't earn relationship with God, we receive one. But having said all that, his day-to-day life was very normal, very, very, very typical. He was the Son of God after all. He was the Savior of the world after all, and yet he didn't drive a car, even though it would have been 2,000 years before they were invented-ish, right? He didn't ride a camel. He walked, because that's what people did. They walked, and they wasted a lot of time walking. He had a job. Tekton is the Greek word, often translated carpenter, probably more accurately translated stonemason, which means that he worked out, which means he didn't have to do push-ups in his office. He had a family. He didn't have a wife himself, but he had siblings. He had parents. He went to synagogue on Saturday. He celebrated festivals in Jerusalem. He grieved the loss of friends and family when they died. It was normal by many estimations of what we mean by the word normal. It was typical. And yet when you take that and you couple it with the observation that even the most ardent critic of Jesus' divinity, the fact that he was God, even the biggest skeptic of that fact would be hard-pressed to deny the fact that no human has ever had more impact on culture. Like, no one has left a stronger fingerprint, if you will, on culture moving forward. And those two things, I would suggest, marry to form a really, really encouraging truth. It's that huge impact, normal existence. It would mean that part of you, the divine spark in you, that part of you that's made in the image of God, that part of you, whether you follow Jesus or not, that really desires to matter, that really desires to make an impact. And when it's not contained, it can become very self-absorbed for sure, but still nonetheless given from God, that you would matter, that the world would be better because you exist, because that your neighborhood, your occupation, whatever it is, that part of you that needs to make a mark. What it would mean is that realizing that, like fulfilling that heartfelt desire that comes from the fact that you're made by God, it's not about the right job. It's not about achieving a certain socioeconomic status. It's not about a particular level of beauty or an appearance. It's not about the car that you drive or the house that you live in or the community that you live in. It's not about any of those things. You don't have to be a professional athlete. You don't have to be a famous personality. You don't have to have freakish levels of gifting in any area. Because Jesus made this huge impact on culture, and yet he made it in the mundane, in the monotonous of life. Which tells me that opportunity, that desire you have to matter, is realized, not by getting the right job, not that there's anything wrong with getting the ideal job, but by taking advantage of these opportunities that present themselves every day. And that's what we mean by organic. The relationships you already have, the occupation you already hold, the neighborhood you already live in, afford you tremendous opportunity to matter. This last weekend, if you were at the 11, one of the things we got to do was we did a baby dedication, or in this case, a child dedication, which are one of my very favorite things to do because it's so neat to see parents go like, we believe this child's from God. We're going to do everything we can to raise them to follow Jesus, and we recognize we need help, which is God's desire. And so Lauren and her son Tristan and their family came up, and they were in the front row before the service, and I went up and I was meeting Tristan, who's 3, and thus, remember, we made him fly, and he's kind of outgoing and kind of shy all at the same time. And I think it was Lauren introduced me. She said, Tristan, this is Pastor Adam. And I twinged a little bit, because I have these quirks, and they involve the Denver Broncos and tracks, but I've been told I can't talk about those for a couple months. And the word pastor is the third one. And so I said to Tristan, oh, Tristan, you don't have to call me pastor, because if you call me Pastor Adam, then I've got to call you Pastor Tristan. To which he I think he actually buried his head in his hands. I was amused. You're not. Neither was he. My angst there, though, it's not out of a disregard for the fact that God's word talks about certain people being gifted in that area of pastoring, though I'm not even sure that that's where I'm gifted. It's not out of disrespect for a couple thousand years of sacred church history. It's to push back against the notion that says that because I work for a church, I have opportunities for God's kingdom to crash in through my life, and because you don't, you don't. I think that's twisted backwards, 180 degrees wrong, if anything. Anybody who works for a church will tell you that the people who don't have way more opportunity to represent Jesus well than those of us who do. It's to push back and say no. Kingdom bringing is organic. It's not about titles. It's not about organizations. It's not about facilities. It's about the everyday life and God's kingdom crashing in through the wiring that God has given us. And so I guess this series is a really concerted effort to go, let's not become a church that's 10 years old, that said, yeah, we talked a big game. We talked about helping one another, help friends move, and we talked about meeting needs as they arose, and we talked about not allowing our entire Christian life to be dictated by an organizational church calendar. We talked a big game. But we became just like every other movement, and now our calendars are full, and everybody's busy serving on Sunday morning, so no one has time to serve anywhere else. I guess this is an effort to go let's not do that. Organic kingdom bringing, in my mind, was done by a friend who heard that her coworker was going to have to move, and it was one of those very sudden moves with very little time. In fact, she found out the week of and had to move on the weekend, and there was some relational severing that was happening there, which meant that she was going to be moving by herself. And because of the amount of money taken up in finding a new place to live, she'd be moving with her Ford Explorer and nothing else. And my friend, she said, well, hold on. Having heard her talk about that, I think I've got some friends that would help you with that. And through a process of emails and text messages and a lot of work on her own part, rallied a group of friends who showed up at her friend's house that following Saturday at 7 in the morning, and a bunch of her friends who didn't even know this other friend helped this gal move for a couple hours, and it took 2 hours to do what would have taken a single mom a week. I think that's organic kingdom bringing, and that's what we mean. Or I think of my friend Kari, who has some friends who were in their 70s, and they were lifetime smokers, and they decided that they were going to quit smoking, and they did. Which is huge accomplishment, right? And then after having quit smoking, they decided they were going to celebrate the fact that they'd quit smoking by painting their living room for obvious reasons. And in the process of quitting and celebrating and getting to painting, the husband actually got sick and he died. And my friend Kari, she heard that story and she said, well, then she heard the now widow say, but I'd still like to paint the living room. And so Kari said, well, I think I've got a group of friends who would love to help paint the living room. That's what we mean by organic kingdom bringing. Or some friends of ours who heard that the city was bringing in a CCC crew to help with the pine beetles this summer. And then they heard that Brad from the city, who's a friend of ours, was actually going to try to put them in a house rather than put them in tents, because normally they stay in tents, and he thought it'd be a nice respite. And so these friends of ours heard that, and they have some rental property, and they said, well, he could stay at our house, even though other people laughed at him and said, without a one-year lease, like, you're not getting a rental. And so they said, well, we can figure that out. It'll be a win-win. They can stay there for 2 weeks. But then I think where the organic kingdom bringing started was when they heard that for those 2 weeks they'd be staying in an apartment that didn't have any pots or pans or dishes or any of the amenities that would come with actually living in a house, and so it's like they might as well camp anyway. And so they said, well, maybe we can rally some people to provide some pots and pans and silverware and such. That's what we mean by this. And yet the difficulty is we're all busy, right? Like, none of you are sitting around going like, I got nothing to do. And if you do, you turn on ESPN and suddenly it feels like you've got something to do, right? Like, no one's sitting around going like, we need to find something to take up our time. And for that matter, none of us is going, you know what, I got too much money. I got to figure out what to do with all this money. Like, no one's doing that. And yet both those things are requirements to actually mattering on the everyday level, right? Like, if you're really going to serve your friends and your coworkers and people spontaneously and kids who are in your kids' class, if you're really going to do that stuff like tires for a mom who you see your tires are bald or a winter coat or whatever it is, it requires margin in both your time and your money. It requires going like, I'm gonna leave some margin in my schedule so that I can actually meet some needs. I'm going to leave some margin in my budget so that I can actually serve some people. By the way, biggest criticism of in the assessment phase in church planting, there's an assessment phase that typically the planting pastor and his wife go through, and basically it's kind of like defending a thesis, I suppose, where you're just hammered on the vision of what you're trying to do and whether or not it's theologically correct, and even more so whether or not it'll actually work. Biggest criticism we had in that process, my wife Teresa and I, this would be a few years ago, that it'll never be financially sustainable. Why? They said, because you're talking about a vision that empowers and encourages people to take some of their budget and serve their friends and coworkers and neighbors. And that's great. But if they do that, they're never going to give on Sunday. And it'll never support itself. To which I go, logical. And yet it's working. But it takes space. And so the question I want to ask this morning, actually in this series I'm excited, we're going to talk about occupation, we're going to talk about a lot of what I would call really, really relevant day-to-day things. This morning we're going to start at what might be kind of a really religious place, a really kind of sentimental place, a really emotional place. This morning, because where does it start? Where does it come from, right? Probably many of you are like me, like, okay, I get the academia part of it, I get the intellectual part of it, but how do we actually do this? And where does the drive, the motivation come from? This morning what I want to wrestle with is what you might just call compassion. And to consider, like, is organic kingdom bringing even possible if we don't see people the way Jesus saw people? Because you know what? In the ancient world, when there was a sickness that went through, and some of you may have heard this summer, our friend Vern referenced some of this stuff, but in the ancient world, when a sickness occurred in a community, what was normal was if you were healthy, you left town. And if you were sick, you stayed there and died. And unless you were among the wealthiest of people, you were host, because there was no one to take care of you. So in 165, a plague hit Rome. Many think it was smallpox, and historians debate, but it was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 of the Roman Empire, which was kind of a big deal, right? Died. In fact, in 165, that plague even got Caesar himself. And then in 260, there was another plague that did the exact same thing. One guy writing from actually a plague that happened in Greece, we've kind of unearthed, kind of like God's email address, this statement from an unknown historian. They died with no one to look after them. Indeed, there were many houses in which all the inhabitants perished without any intention for care. The bodies of the dying were heaped up one on top of the other. No fear of God or of man had a restraining influence. Seems barbaric to think of a culture where when someone got sick, you left town and they died. What changed that might be a question. Leprosy. This is something that we're all familiar with. It was both a particular disease and also a generalization of diseases. And in this day, when you contracted leprosy, some sort of visual disease, you were instantly excommunicated to a colony outside of the city gates, and that became your people. So you got to hang out with all the sick people, which isn't a recipe for success either emotionally or any other way, right? So you went and hung out with them. And that's the way it went. And in some parts of the Roman Empire, you were legally mandated to scream at the top of your lungs whenever you brushed shoulders with somebody or whenever you got in eyesight of somebody who didn't have leprosy. Because that's how far you were obligated to stay from healthy people. And in some parts of the Roman Empire, they actually put bells on their clothes so that you were a walking indication of stay away from that person. It just kind of was the way that it went. Slavery, of course, is easy to throw darts at. A system in which people owned people, and it was assumed that people had less rights than dogs. In the ancient world, when a baby was born, it was quite natural, in a way that's almost impossible for us to conceive of, to, at the time of the baby's birth, to decide whether or not you were going to expose it or not. And exposure meant to take it to a city pile where it was preordained, particularly in large metropolitan-type areas, that this is where the babies that aren't wanted go. And babies would die a long, slow death, well, I don't know how long, of exposure. It was normal. There wasn't anything scandalous about it. Of course, the biggest reasons for exposure were definitely illegitimacy and poverty. But not the only. There's cases historically of wealthy people who didn't want to split their wealth 4 ways. So the fourth child went to the heap. Here's historian Seneca saying this: we drown children at birth who are weakly and abnormal. In one Roman city, there were 600 families. 600 families. And the historical records, like the census-type records that they found, indicate that there were 6 families in that community that had more than one daughter. Not necessarily literally. But here's the deal. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't controversial. No one was going I don't know if this is okay. It was as typical as any other decision you and I make without thinking about it today. It was as typical as, I'm going to get a drink out of the drinking fountain. It was normal that if a baby wasn't wanted, you could just discard them. And on and on and on. We could talk about the ancient practice of war. We take for granted medics. But it wasn't that long ago that some people died on the battlefield because they were fatally wounded on the battlefield, and they died before the battle was over. And an even perhaps higher percentage of people died in the days and weeks that followed battle, because as gangrene and things like that took over, you died. Because there was no system in place unless your family came to the battlefield to retrieve you. If you were wounded, you were as good as dead, literally. No one questioned that. No one called that into question. Which I think ought to raise, and it's a perturbing question for historians, okay, so what happened? What shifted? And some would say, well, I'll tell you what shifted. There was this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, and he came, and he lived, and he died, and he resurrected, and he infused his values and his spirit into other people, literally. And these little bands, originally they were called Keepers of the Way of Jesus, and they eventually became called the church, and then church got a capital C, and they took him seriously. In fact, they took his teaching seriously, like in Matthew 25, where it says, then the king will say to those on his right, come you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger, invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When do we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I mean, if you were to ask the question, who's the most compassionate person to ever live, who would you say? Church. One answer that's pretty safe. It's Jesus. Why? Well, because the more you read his account, you realize you can't go anywhere without being confronted with his compassion. In Mark 1, a man comes up to him, a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus was indignant. At what? At the institution of the way lepers were treated. He reached out his hand and touched him. I'm willing. He touched him. You don't touch a leper. He had compassion on him. In Mark 5, he encounters a demon-possessed man who was among the worst of the worst, literally chained to keep him away from normal people. Jesus saw him, and the text says, was moved by compassion and healed him. In Mark 9, he comes across a father who is distraught because his son is just tormented by demons, throws him into fires and such. Jesus, the text says, has compassion on the son and healed him. In Matthew 20, there are these two blind guys, and they're like on the edge of the street as Jesus is walking by, homeless people, if you will, and they're screaming, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us." And the people around him are going, "Shut up. This is a dignified person. We're supposed to clean the streets of people like you when the president comes to town," right? And Jesus, the text says, had compassion on them, and he healed them. In Luke 7, there's what I find to be a very moving story where it says, soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Widow, only son. Her only choice now will be prostitution. And a large crowd from town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said simply, "Don't cry. Don't cry." Jesus was this intense person of compassion. Yet it wasn't just in the healing stories. In another place, there's a prostitute who's caught in the act of adultery, which we could get into the institutional stuff there, but we won't. And they bring him to Jesus. And the assumption, of course, is if you're having a religious conversation about a prostitute, is like, here's your chance, tee off, like knock her out, right? And Jesus defends her. He stands up for her. A little bit later, he encounters a guy named Levi. Like, how many of you guys send the IRS thank you notes? Like, so religious people, non-religious people, they all hated the tax collectors. Levi was one. Jesus said, "Hey, I'd like to go to your house, and you should invite your friends." It's even evident in his stories. He tells one story commonly referred to as the prodigal son, in which a father whose son ran off and did everything the father wouldn't want him to do and rejected God and blew all of his inheritance, comes back, and the Jewish people anticipated, because this was a story that Jesus was actually copying, he was stealing from the Jewish culture, then the normal story was that the father stands his ground and proves his manliness by saying, "Be gone." Jesus flips the story on its head and tells of the father running to his son and embracing him. Another instance, there's a man who's beat up and left on the side of a road, and the priest and the Levite, the religious people, they step over him, and a Samaritan, like a guy from Al-Qaeda, I don't know how we even create a parallel to that, stops and takes care of him, tends to his wounds. And Jesus says, that kind of compassion, that's from the Lord. The question becomes, where does it come from? Because probably none of us would read those accounts and hear those stories and go, "I don't want to be that person. Like, I'd rather be the grumpy person at the office. I'd rather be the neighborhood grouch," right? The issue is, how do we move from the intellect to the heart? How do we actually flesh this stuff out? And some, I think in more cynical fashion, would say that Jesus was able to do that because he was of a certain temperament that you can either have or you don't have. Like, that he was emotionally sensitive, that he was kind of one of those guys who couldn't stand to see somebody suffer. Like, he didn't like to hunt, and he didn't like to fish, and I'm not saying anything wrong with that if that's you, right? But like, he didn't like to see things in pain. He didn't like to see suffering. But the problem that I have with that theology is that Jesus was actually pretty good at inflicting people with suffering. Like, he kind of had a habit of making people suffer on occasion. Like, in one case, he walked into the temple, and he was so bent out of shape about the circumstances that he saw and the corruption that he started grabbing money tables and flipping them around. Like, you should go try it. Like, walk into Wells Fargo this week and like kind of just start going crazy. See how it goes. Just don't tell him where you got the idea. And then he actually like grabbed a whip. And I don't know, like, would the parallel be like grabbing the security guy's gun? Not sure. But I don't think he was just making noise in the air either. He was making a point. And to make his point, he was causing some people to suffer, frankly. In another case, he said to some religious guys, probably none of you have said it quite like this, to me anyway, "You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good?" He's talking to religious people. "For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks." How does a guy who is that compassionate and yet at the same time that blunt, how do you explain that? Well, have you ever noticed that people who are particularly good at something, they see things that others don't? Like, if you're really good at something, you have a heightened awareness. Sarah, who's worked with us now for almost 2 years, texted me from a hockey game this week and said, "You've ruined me. I can't even go to a hockey game without critiquing the way they take care of people and an event in general." What is that? Well, it's somebody who kind of sees through the grid of an event, of a gathering. If you're a musician and you're a music snob, then you're friends with Lenny. But it's because you see things that other people don't see, right? You appreciate nuances to music that people like me who just like, we don't even understand anything, we just hear rhythm, We don't hear. If you're a golfer, you can watch someone swing a golf club and know, like, that's wrong. I mean, this is particularly true in athletics, right? What if Jesus was the master of relationships? What if no one's ever been better at relationships? And what if what he saw that no one before him was able to see was that underneath that label, underneath that cloak, called a prostitute or a leper or a thief or whatever, was the image of God, was someone who had unexplainable value because of their Father in heaven? What if Jesus had this unique ability to cut right through it all and go, ultimately, you're a prince or a princess, and I know it's churchy and I know it's cliche, but it seems like Jesus changed the world with that perspective. Heard the story about a 3-year-old little girl who was having a hard time staying in bed. Many of you can appreciate that, the up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and it's like, I'm going to put you to bed at 6 o'clock if it takes till 8 for you to go to sleep, that deal. Finally, the dad, after like 45 minutes, went in and sat on the bed next to his daughter, and he said, what is going on? Like, why can't you go to sleep? And she said, I can't stop thinking. Well, what are you thinking about? She said, I'm thinking about when I'm a bride and you're my prince. Because this is the age when little girls mix all that stuff up, right? And he said, oh, honey, that can't ever happen. She said, why? And he said, well, because I'm already mommy's prince, and society frowns upon stuff of that nature. And she said, well, then who's going to be my prince? And he said, well, I don't know. It might be Johnny, and it might be Mikey. And he started listing all these different little boys that she knew, And then he started going, like, and you know what? Like, you might not even know them yet. Like, they might live somewhere else. You're only 3. They might not even be born yet. I mean, they could be in a different part of the world. You might not. And he just kept going on and on and on, and her eyes were getting bigger and bigger, and she was getting more and more overwhelmed. And finally he said, tell you what, honey, how about when it's time for you to find your prince, you let Daddy pick him out for you? I don't know where you're at in life's journey. I don't know what you've been through. I don't know what mistakes you've made. I don't know what labels you carry. I don't know what shame you carry. But I know because of this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, that when God looks at you, he sees through all of that, and he says, princess, daughter of the king. And I don't know as a man what you've been through and what your bad habits are and what your tendencies are and what shame you carry. I know that Jesus makes vividly clear that when God looks at you, he says, a man of infinite worth. Not that you earn it, you receive it. And maybe like this morning's not even about organic kingdom bringing for you. Maybe it's just about the simple truth of the gospel, that God is a God who places value upon people like no one else ever has. There was this culture where when a town was sick, people just died. And these early followers of Jesus said, not on our watch. And they decided that while everyone else was exiting town, they would stay in town and they would take care of these people. In fact, here's a historical quote, heedless of the danger. They took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were inflicted by others of the disease, drawing upon themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Translation, they took care of them, contracted the disease, and died, and worshiped God in doing so. Another guy, a Basla of Nisa, around this same time was fired up about the way lepers were treated, and he was a Christ follower, and he talked to his brother Gregory, who was kind of a big deal in Christianity at that time, and they decided that they were going to try to start raising some funds to start these organizations who would take care of sick people who couldn't afford to provide for their own care, or who didn't have any care or didn't have any family. And so Gregory started preaching these sermons saying, like, they too, lepers and the sick, they are made in God's image, and they secured the funds to start these things. In fact, a council of Nisa in that same area then later made the decision that whenever a church was planted, so too would a hospital be started. In fact, that's why hospitals often are called things like St. Pete's, because it was a Christ-following idea. Inspired by the compassion of God, people went, wait a minute, we should have these organizations that take care of people, which, by the way, historically speaking, these hospitals were the world's first volunteer-driven nonprofit organizations. Inspired by Christ. Another guy, Henry Durant, was sick at what he saw in the practice of war, and he decided that he would Go start taking care of one soldier at a time after the battle was over. And he did, and he'd crawl out there. Sometimes the battle was still going on and take care of people, what we would call a medic. Actually, the movement that he started is now known as the Red Cross. Just going like, I think Christ would have me take care of soldiers. Another guy named Damien, now known as Father Damien, should you Wikipedia him or something, was also passionate. This is in the Western Hemisphere. He was also passionate about lepers and people who had sickness, and decided to start a movement of kind of created a colony essentially where he gathered these guys together and women and preached value to them. And every morning he started by saying, you have infinite worth because you are a child of God. And then someone noted that one morning he started by saying, he would say, you lepers have infinite worth because you're a child of God. And then one morning he started by saying, we lepers have infinite worth because he had contracted it in taking care of them. Another guy named Theodor Flichner. With a name like that, you better be German and you better be a Lutheran, right? And he was both. And in the early 1800s, he recognized that in that part of Europe, hospitals didn't exist. And he started a movement where he would take peasant women and he would train them to take care of sick people. We call them nurses. And a whole movement of hospitals spread across that part of Europe as a result of this guy. The early church, from day one, placed this value upon rescuing these babies that had been exposed. And as much as they could, they would bring them into their own families, but there's only so many Hopkins in the world who can have 85 of their own children. And so they started to figure out that, there are these monastic communities where these people are devoted to God. Maybe they could just fit within the system of these monasteries. And so they started taking babies to these monasteries, and historically speaking, we know that as the advent of orphanages. Born out of people who had Christ's compassion in their heart. John Newton was a slave trader, one of the best in Britain, one of the most successful, one of the most brutal. And in midlife, towards latter life, he met Christ, was gripped by his compassion, and ultimately went this is wrong. He actually quit the slave trade and became quite the advocate for getting rid of slavery. And in the process of doing so, he actually wrote a song. You've all heard of it. It's a song that's designed to capture God's grace in rescuing people from slavery and the parallel of being rescued from sin ourselves. The song written by John Newton is called Amazing Grace. Written by a Christ follower, driven by his compassion. Actually, a guy named William Wilberforce came to John Newton. He was a politician and was ready to quit politics because he was so sickened by the whole process. And John Newton was able to talk him into not quitting and instead staying in and using his position and his authority to steer the ship. And Britain can brag that they're one of the only nations, the only I'm aware of, who got rid of slavery not through civil war, not through a major uprising, but through the democratic process. Because a Christ follower named William Wilberforce went this doesn't fit. I don't know where this lands for you. It just seems to me that if we're going to talk about being organic kingdom bringers, it starts by seeing people the way Jesus did. That it's not about a principle. It's not about doing something because it's the right thing to do. It's about begging God to help us see people the way he does. And maybe there's specific people that come to mind. Maybe it just involves being more gracious and friendly in your everyday life. Maybe just being more open to people in general. But before we talk about these specifics and these ideas and these handles of how we can do organic kingdom bringing, I think it starts by going, Lord, make us a people of compassion. And maybe you're someone who stepped into the room tonight not knowing where you're at with the Lord, and for the first time what's clear to you is it's not about earning, it's about receiving. That it's God's compassion, his grace that saves, not going to church or reading your Bible or anything else. Maybe this morning's about you and God getting right with one another. I just want to pray and give you a chance to talk to God about whatever it is you're thinking, and then we're going to actually sing our way out of here. So, you, just in the solitude of where you're at, talk to God about whatever it is you're thinking about. Maybe there's a specific person, maybe just a general call to living with a different presence. Maybe God's inviting you into receiving his forgiveness, and talk to him about that. Lord, as is so often the case, this is one of those things that's really easy to talk about and be inspired by the neat stories of times past, and quite another to find the energy and the awareness and the power of you in us to flesh this out. So as we look ahead to hanging on to our value of the ordinary, everyday opportunities that life affords us, God, I pray that this would be a year where we would grow in our compassion, and that you'd give us wisdom in how we flesh that out and who is the recipient of that. We love you, Jesus. Amen.